Good evening, everybody. Thanks very much for joining us in what has become an annual International Women's Day webinar hosted kindly by the Cure Parkinson's Trust. In fact, this is our third year, and this year's International Women's Day theme is Accelerate Action. And so we're focusing on how we can accelerate the action of including sex and gender in Parkinson's research. My name is Richelle Flanagan, and I'll be moderating this evening's webinar alongside my co-chair, Shafaq. I'm a registered dietitian of the last 20 years, and I noticed my Parkinson's symptoms when I was 3 months pregnant with my second child. That was almost 9 years ago, and for the last 6 years, I've been advocating alongside many other women with Parkinson's and several women neurologists and researchers for better care and research for women with PD. Shafaq, would you like to introduce yourself?
Thank you very much, Richelle. So yes, hi, I'm Shafaq. I was diagnosed 6 years ago with early onset Parkinson's disease when I was 40 years old. And I'm a dentist. I live and work in South Yorkshire. My interest in gender inequity began, obviously, with me being female. But I went through an incident at my GP where I would say, putting it politely, dismissed by my male GP. Anyway, that put me off, despite me being quite outspoken, as some of you all know. And I didn't go back for a couple of years, which struck me, it really struck me that if I can be that put off, what must other women feel like as well, because I'm quite confident. That is what made me think that we need to get more involved in shouting and speaking up for ourselves. I mean, for me, it had very bad consequences. I developed osteopenia, and I wasn't managed very well at all. I didn't stay shouty. I was going through early menopause, and they didn't diagnose it. So I developed osteopenia and had lots of other problems as well. But there you go. That's me in a nutshell.
Thanks, Shafaq. So now I'm going to delighted to introduce our panel for this evening's webinar. So firstly, we have Professor Camille Carroll, Professor of Clinical Neuroscience at Newcastle University and the University of Plymouth, as well as an honorary consultant neurologist at University Hospitals Plymouth, the NHS Trust. We have Dr. Manon Offray, a pharmacist and neuroscience researcher at the University of Rennes, University Hospital of Rennes, I'm not saying that right, Rennes, and the Institut de Neurosciences Clinique, again, de Rennes. Dr. Offray also serves as a member of the MDS Women in Movement Disorders Group. And we have Dr. Laura Smith, who's a lecturer in health psychology, a research psychologist and behavioral scientist within the Centre for Preventive Neurology at the Wolfson Institute of Population Health, Queen Mary University, London. Her research focuses on using psychological and neuropsychological theories to better understand, assess and treat neurological conditions, including Parkinson's. And sadly, we're missing lovely Sarah Dolan, who is on the GEM-PD advisory board, which recently announced this funding for looking at specifically at women in Parkinson's research. She sends her apologies. Unfortunately, she got caught in a snowstorm in the US. So we're sorry we can't have her today, but we'll get her back again. So basically what we're going to do is we've put together some slides to kind of set the scene with regard to our discussion with our esteemed panel tonight. So I'm just going to share that, and Shafaq is going to start it off. So I'm just going to here. Where are the slides gone? There we go. Sorry, should have gone from the beginning. Okay, so
can everyone see yeah, I think that we're on the first slide. So yes, this is our preamble to what our lovely colleagues will be saying on the panel. So just a backdrop to sex and gender in Parkinson's. Could we have the next slide, Richelle? So this was one of the grassroots surveys, which was carried out by the Women's Parkinson's Project and PD Avengers. It shows quite clearly that in the build up to the week before one's period, in the week before one's period, 86% of women said that they were feeling rubbish. That carried on through the menstrual period. but decreased. 50% of people began to say PD was worse, and it gets less through the cycle until people begin to feel a lot better, and then the cycle begins again as people go round and they get to the premenstrual week again where they're feeling like rubbish. So it just shows quite clearly how hormones and our Parkinson's symptoms are quite clearly interlinked. This was then followed by and validated by a study done by Fox Insight, which indicated that 44% of people with Parkinson's indicated less effectiveness of the medication in the week before menses, which just goes to show it's something which really does need to be looked into. These two surveys led to two webinars being carried out. And one of which was actually hosted by Cure Parkinson's, and it led to a paper published by Indu Subramanian et al. In 2022, which was called The Unmet Needs of Women with Parkinson's, and revealed a whole host of problems, not just, I feel a bit rubbish around my period. Some of the problems were, when we discovered, yes, women do get a lot of motor symptoms, not as many as men, but some of the motor symptoms that we do get are different to men. So, for example, we get tremor more and we get more dyskinesia. But what we experience more than men is non-motor symptoms and psychosocial issues, so depression, anxiety, sleep issues. These are things which concern us more. And obviously, the paper also showed menses, pregnancy, perimenopause, and menopause need to be looked at further as well, because there's no published data on how women going through these phases of their life should navigate their life when they have Parkinson's. So then the writers then went on to look at how research can be conducted to improve the unmet needs of women with Parkinson's. So they came up, we can see it there yourselves, but obviously animal models need to be looked at. We need to look at whether surgical menopause has earlier onset of Parkinson's. Does it bring it on earlier? Does it not? We need to look at menopause itself, and natural menopause as well, and whether that has an increased risk of women developing Parkinson's as well. And if so, do we need to administer HRT to women at that time critical window to make sure that they have a lesser chance of developing, or slows down the chance of their developing Parkinson's disease? These are all studies which need to be carried out. We need randomized control trials, which I know makes all researchers roll their eyes, but we need them. We really do. Otherwise, we're never going to be able to change rules and regulations. So far, we think there's 4 in 10 of us of people with Parkinson's that are women. Richelle will speak more to this point later on. But moving on from that, not only are we at 40% a minority, but there's also other things which became obvious in this other paper by Tsai et al., which was just published in January this year, which shows that not only are women underrepresented in research, but also racial and ethnic minorities are very underrepresented. And this is something I personally feel quite passionate about, because I work with Parkinson's UK in the Race Equality in Research steering group. And it's something we are constantly trying to push, because people of different ethnicities are underrepresented. And it's really important that in order for us to achieve the whole picture of what Parkinson's is, we look at not just men and women, but men and women of all ethnicities to get the full picture, because until we have that, we can't solve the puzzle. And this is our good friend, Barbara Salzberg. Now we're going to try and play it and see if it works, because she has a few words for us. Let's see.
My name's Barbara Salzberg Matthews, and I'm delighted to have illustrated these 5 stages of Parkinson's as represented by young women with different ethnicities, because as women, we don't often see ourselves reflected in the drawings that are associated with the people who have Parkinson's. It seems to be white older men. So our time has come, and that's why I illustrated it. Hopefully we'll change stereotypes, and because about 40% of people who have Parkinson's are women, and unfortunately more and more younger women and men are getting this disease. So if you're aware, then you can get help. So that's why I made this artwork. Happy International Women's Day. James Barber.
So these images will actually be released on Saturday, which is International Women's Day, through the support of Parkinson's Europe. But Barbara has very kindly let us show you the pre-release copy images before they go on general release. So as you can see, that's young women, older women, different ethnicities, and this is all so important. And we would really, really appreciate it if researchers began to use these images alongside, if they really want to, the old white male, but maybe we could have someone come up with some men of different ethnicities as well. It's really important because what one sees in artwork, in journals, in research, is that we feel is reflective of the society, and if it's not correctly represented, then people are getting the wrong ideas.
Thanks, Shafaq.
And now it's Richelle's turn.
So just on that, I believe Barbara is actually going to be doing some of the men as well. So I'm just going to go through a few slides about sex and gender, and Parkinson's research is starting to appear. And the first area is just looking at the prevalence. So quite interestingly, the question is whether this 40% is accurate. A recent study of prevalence of Parkinson's in Poland showed that women actually were Parkinson's 1.2 times more common in women. And then recently was drawn to my attention by a physiotherapy researcher in Australia, this study that showed that actually there was a higher prevalence of women in Australia with Parkinson's than men. And what was quite interesting as well, looking at the age profile, that actually 34% were under the age of 69. And this particular study looked at the commencement of add-on therapy. So, bringing add-on therapy earlier into the treatment process. So although women accounted for 54% of the population with Parkinson's, only 42% women had add-on therapy. And I suppose that beggars the question, are women not been given the same treatment, or is it that they don't need the treatment as early as men? So this then again highlights the point, this study here, looking at the proportion of females in infusion therapy studies. And the results, while it showed that, 38% of women on average were in these studies, the proportion varied between 17% to 56%. And the authors, stated that sex was not a randomization stratification factor in any of the studies that they looked at. And only one study explored the differences in outcome estimated according to sex. Also, just the point around the dyskinesia, it's a side effect of the medication. And we know time and time again that women suffer more from this. And the research recently in a paper showed that women might require 25% lower weight normalized levodopa dose versus men. And also CONT enzyme levels are 25% lower in women, which also might be one of the factors that may be leading to dyskinesia. And just, often it's said that dyskinesia is not a troublesome symptom, but these are two quotes from young onset women, which would beg her to differ. The first lady had lost almost 6 kilograms, and the second lady said that it's possibly her worst Parky symptom. So this then, I'll just say that this data is from My Moves Matter app, which I developed in response to the unmet needs paper, where we wanted to have an app that enabled women to track their symptoms across their menstrual cycle, so that we could sort of prove the point that this is actually happening. And we have a study happening with UCC, which is just coming to the end, which was looking at the different hormonal stages of women around the world. And we also have a study that's been funded by France Parkinson's that's starting in 4 neurological centres in France, looking at this impact of the menstrual cycle on young women with Parkinson's. But the app is actually used by men and women, and it's probably about a 70% women, 30% men. But we looked at the top 10 aggregated symptoms of both men and women. And you can see they're quite different. So it does reflect that women do have a higher tremor rate, but actually, and they do have dyskinesia. It doesn't appear in the top 10 men symptoms, but you'll see the profile of the symptoms are quite different. So whilst women are sort of more around the sort of bradykinesia, rigidity, which is the difficult typing, the sleeping, the joint pains, which is not surprising because women tend to have more sort of especially if as they're going postmenopausal, they become more inflammatory and pain can be more of a problem. But in terms of the men, they're quite distinct, different symptoms in terms of loss of balance, swallow issues, low voice, and loss of smell, which seem to be more disabling symptoms. And I suppose the point of this is that we need more real world data, and maybe then we need to be treating or doing research based on the difference in sex differences. So then I'm just going to highlight a paper, a very interesting paper called Let's Talk About Sex, the differences in drug therapy in males and females. And they are saying, why bother? And so, they're saying that if sex differences are not considered in preclinical trials, then surely the experimental results may not be reproducible. Also, if we don't look at the cellular preclinical response to medicines in a sex-specific manner, we're missing out on the potential to actually look at early indications of potential differences that could affect the subsequent process of drug development. And if women are not included in early clinical trials, surely the real-world effects of medicines such as dyskinesia in women with Parkinson's will not be detected before it's released in the market. And one of our panelists, Manon, was a co-author in a paper that actually highlighted that if levodopa was to be produced today, it may not actually have made it to the market. And also, it's known in general that women experience more unwanted side effects than men, and the magnitude of the problem is difficult to assess, as many countries do not have not included sex information in their statutory reports of side effects. So this is in general, not just Parkinson's. And new reporting guidelines are advocating for the disaggregation of data by sex in large comparative studies and meta-analysis to enable to this prediction of unwanted side effects better, which obviously would be very good for women. So just sorry, slide move. So in this paper, they also have a great image which kind of highlights all the different ways that researchers could include sex and gender in their research. And finally, just this is kind of a project based in the UK, and Dr. Claire Bale from Parkinson's UK highlighted this to us. And this project basically is about the fact that scientific consideration of sex and gender is the responsibility of the many and not the few. And this kind of started our discussion about the theme for the webinar this year, that we should focus on the research community and see how can we actually, make this responsibility of the many in Parkinson's research and not the few. So just to kind of, before we go into the questions of the panel, just to highlight the differences between sex and gender. So sex is more like about the biological attributes that differentiate females and males. And the gender then really refers to an aspect of a person's identity. So it's more about the social constructs that affects research and outcomes. So I'm just going to end this slide there and stop sharing, and then we will come to the panel. So I think, Shafaq, you're first up.
Yep. So to expand on the why, we thought it might be good to touch on some of the research questions that currently need to be explored for women with Parkinson's. There is a growing interest in the impacts of hormones and hormonal stages on Parkinson's symptoms and progression. So Laura, we were wondering, would you be able to talk to the point where you question, like, what is some of this evidence for differences in hormonal stages in younger and older onset, and what sort of implications does this have for our clinical care?
Yeah, I think you highlighted some of those really nicely within your presentation. So we see fluctuations in motor and non-motor symptoms during and a few days before the menstrual cycle. And you highlighted as well how drug efficacy is impacted during menstruation. I think what I'd really like to see is more evidence around the kind of lived experience of that, which it seems like Richelle is trying to make progress towards capturing. People are already trying to kind of track that themselves using apps. But guess what that means for people is that sort of weeks out of every single month, their sort of dailies of activity and functioning is going to be impacted. So I think that's, really important for us to address within clinical practice, and maybe future projects looking at that evidence that people are capturing themselves using apps and tracking devices, sort of thinking about how that can then be linked with healthcare data and other types of data. So I think that's really exciting step forward, that we could harness those different types of remote data collection And you also spoke about worsening of symptoms during menopause, and again, that being due to kind of fluctuations in hormone levels. And I think for me, sort of research areas that are kind of exploring the complexities around these overlapping symptoms, that's really of interest, particularly when we start to talk about symptoms that are perhaps described as sort of non-specific. So things like fatigue, sleep disturbances, muscle pains, and why it's really complicated to kind of distinguish between what's menopause, what's Parkinson's, or perhaps other health-related conditions. And there's a sort of research area popping up around sort of medical gaslighting, and that some of these kind of non-specific symptoms might be easily sort of dismissed, which I think, Shafaq, you kind of alluded to in your description of your diagnosis journey. So perhaps some of these non-specific symptoms maybe can mean that people have a delayed diagnosis or potentially end up under the care of the wrong specialist. So I think research may be looking into those diagnosis journeys and again, harnessing different types of data. So from healthcare records, from people's lived experience, and also more kind of objective measures would be really useful.
Yeah, that sounds really good to me, actually. And I like that term, medical gaslighting. I'm going to make sure I use that. Camille, could we ask, additionally, recent research has indicated that women's hormones, for example, estrogen, are potentially neuroprotective and anti-inflammatory. This has yet to be explored with regards to Parkinson's pathology. Have you got any ideas or thoughts on this as yet?
Yeah, thanks, Shafaq. I mean, just checking my little bars down here. So I managed that earlier today. I spoke several sentences with no volume. I mean, it is starting to be looked at for sure, and it's quite possible, if not probable, this is some a contributor to the sex difference in incidence rates being with Parkinson's being more prevalent, more highly incident, I should say, in men, and therefore more prevalent in men also. That some of that risk might be driven by a protective effect of hormones in women. And there are studies that look at this in animal models and cell culture models, and as you say, have started to tease apart some of what might be contributing to that at a cellular level. I mean, how this translates through then into clinical research and impact on patient care, I guess, is the big question.
Yes.
And there we're sort of stymied by everything that you've talked about. You and Richelle have highlighted already that women participating in research studies, the representation hasn't been sufficient, I guess, to answer some of those questions, particularly younger women, of course, and there might be several reasons for that I could touch on now or later. There are epidemiological methodologies which are quite interesting, which might allow us to get a handle on some of these questions, I guess, in a slightly different way. So, for example, are women who take the oral contraceptive pill at a lower risk of developing Parkinson's, or at a higher risk? If women have HRT with Parkinson's, does that slow their rate of progression or
That's
impact?
precisely the sort of thing we look into.
Yeah, exactly. So those are difficult trials to do. They're also difficult epidemiological studies to do, but the technology in terms of the methodology is getting there. And also the other thing that is improving, I think, just with the digital age that we're moving into is coding. So if we're going to look at data sets, of course, the ability to interrogate those data sets to answer some of these interesting questions will completely depend on how accurate those data are, and that's dependent. Whenever we have a healthcare interaction, that's coded in our care records. And if that coding isn't accurate, then we can't answer the questions. And as we understand, just nationally and internationally, the power of these big data sets, a lot more attention, I guess, is being paid to coding and checking the accuracy of coding, which will then allow us to use GP data sets across the UK, for example, to answer some of these questions.
That's brilliant. I think there's lots still to be done, but I think you've highlighted some of what needs to be done very well. Manon, could I ask, as we know, research has a direct impact on clinical care. What questions has this lack of representation sparked in regard to medications and treatment? So with your background as a pharmacologist, is there any differences you found between men and women and how we respond to Parkinson's medication? Do women, in your experience, suffer different or more side effects?
In Parkinson's disease, just like in other disorders and diseases, we see some differences in how men and women respond to medication. So there are obviously more adverse events in women than in men, regardless of the disease. That may be due to doses that are not, designed for women, but it may also be due to several other factors that are related to how our body actually behave with the medication, meaning differences in pharmacokinetics, so in drug absorption, in metabolism, which is how the body uses and destructs the drug in a way. So distribution also may be different due to body fat composition and so on between men and women. And also metabolism with the enzymes that may have some genetic variability, but also just inter-individual variability. So it's not just like men and women, as you highlighted during your presentation, it's also women, there are differences inside the women group based on your, if you're a childbearing age and so on. So it's another layer of complexity to include in studies. For instance, if you're looking at men and women, if you include a group of women that are 30 versus 70 years old, you're looking at two different groups within the same group. So if you want to include all of these biases and confounding factors, you have to have a large population in each of these groups, which might be difficult to do based on the constraint we have on research at the moment. So definitely having more data and multi-center studies would be really helpful in better understanding how drug behaves in women in general, but also in different types of age and hormone-related situation. And even within the same woman, you already highlighted that the body responds to medication differently based on your menstrual cycle. So even as an own individual, you have some differences that needs to be taken into account. And on the pharmacological point of view, that should point out towards avenue of research of developing drug tablets that would be more user-friendly than it is today. And so in the US, they have developed a tablet of levodopa, carbidopa, that can be segmented, that is designed to be segmented in different parts. Those again can be adjusted in your daily life activities, for instance. And that's also a very pragmatic way of designing drugs and developing drugs as pharmaceutical industry that could be helpful also for women.
Brilliant, thank you. I'm going to move on now and let Richelle take the next question, if that's a set of questions.
Okay. So I'm just going to, move on to what some of the gaps are within research. So the barriers conducting research in sex and gender differences that need to be addressed to move this field forward. So Laura, coming back to you and your work, what areas do you think need to be improved, in terms of maybe assessment tools for capturing differences or research techniques, or, do you have any view on that?
Yeah, so I think, we've established there are gaps in sort of finding out where there are gender or sex differences, but I think another sort of gap is really teasing apart sort of why there are gaps and thinking about the biological, the psychological, and the sort of social mechanisms at play. And I think some of the panel members already kind of alluded to understanding some of those and how they maybe intersect with other differences. So, for example, one of the areas I'm interested in is REM sleep behavior disorder, which is associated with a higher risk of developing neurodegenerative conditions. And we think there are gender and sex differences there, but the reasons sort of behind that are complex, and I think we have research gaps in trying to tease those apart. So is it that they actually manifest differently between genders and sex, with men perhaps showing more like violent, aggressive behaviours, dream enactment behaviours, and that's why they're picked up differently? Is it that women are more sort of talking behaviours, it's more subtle? Is it a referral bias that's kind of based on a bed partner picking up those and women perhaps more observant? Or if they're a widow, are there going to be differences there? And then that brings on to kind of how we're actually capturing these differences. So the assessment tools, are we kind of just relying on subjective reports? And if so, are they kind of likely to be biased in some way? Can we bring in more objective tools? So for example, sleep studies, and would that be more likely to show some of these differences? Are we accounting for some of these psychosocial factors within our assessment? So having a more kind of comprehensive assessment battery so we can better understand some of these mechanisms, and having more kind of longitudinal studies so we can track some of these over time. Yeah, maybe I'll better let other panel members speak.
I'm just wondering in terms of Laura, you know, I kind of feel sometimes when I complete some of these assessments, I actually did a PDQ, I can't remember what is PDQ 8 or something, is it? And I kind of feel that the questions are very related to more advanced Parkinson's, and, you know, don't really relate to those of us in earlier stages or younger. Have you a view on in terms of, you know, these sort of assessments that maybe they're not sensitive enough for different cohorts?
Yeah, I think there's always a balance, isn't there, between trying to kind of come up with a questionnaire or an assessment that's quite brief and can be sort of sent out to lots of different people versus something more tailored. But certainly we need kind of tools that are sensitive to symptoms in the early stages and for different people presenting with the disease. And I guess I'm more familiar with cognitive assessments, but that's definitely something we've kind of struggled with, having a cognitive assessment that's sensitive to pick up milder deficits, probably in maybe younger individuals or individuals with higher education, and thinking about tailoring assessments to the people we're trying to kind of work with. And we should get feedback from sort of people with lived experience before we administer those assessments to kind of check that they're relevant to the group we want to work with.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. And so Manon, coming back to yourself, what sort of barriers have you run into when conducting, you know, research that is looking at sex and gender? You know, what kind of issues have you come across?
If I speak of personal experience, we are doing currently a study on the pharmacokinetics of apomorphine in patients with Parkinson's disease, and we had to separate the study in two and to start with the men first, because otherwise it would have been very much expensive, and we would have issues to kind of find the funding to have all of the participants we wanted to include. So we had to start with the men in order to make it really compelling as a control population. And then we're going to do a second part with women only. So financial constraints are one thing. The other thing I can think of is also how women are inclined to participate in clinical trials. One thing that may be a factor in that is medical gaslighting, as Shafaq mentioned, because you might not want to participate in a trial because you had bad experience in the past with the medical world or the research in general, but also maybe because you're the caretaker of the family and so you don't have time to go to the sessions and to attend like a long study with a number of follow-ups. Maybe you cannot attend all the follow-ups. So that's also something to consider, how we can make more room to women in our research agenda, and also research priorities and pressure to produce paper. And an article just came out in the BMG today on the situation that the colleagues in the US are encountering with the cut in the finance of studies related to gender and sex and so on in the US since the election of Donald Trump. So it's also something to to consider, because how the priorities, research priorities are chosen definitely impacts how we can do studies on women's health.
Yeah, I suppose yeah, maybe it's an opportunity for European researchers to push forward on the sex and gender side of things. And in terms of Camille, just coming to you, where do you see the gaps in the way we train neurologists, clinicians, and researchers? And do you think this is something that, you know, could help to improve sex and gender and how it's looked at in research and clinical care?
Yeah, absolutely. So the evidence that drives care decisions for clinicians, or rather, I should say, care decisions are based on evidence in a large part, or at least we aspire to that. And that evidence base, of course, comes from inherently biased sources. A lot of it historical, particularly in Parkinson's. Lots of the studies, particularly, and our understanding of Parkinson's comes from studies which were started a few decades ago, and our treatments, of course, are decades old. So we have to think carefully about the nature of those studies and whether they were appropriately balanced and diverse and representative populations taking part in those studies. And of course, we know for a fact they weren't. I think we're getting better as researchers for including women in studies, and there are drivers in the system. And Manon, you alluded to one there, the FDA guidance on ensuring disaggregated analysis for sex and in clinical trials. So that will be a driver in the system that hopefully will allow for better data. But in terms of ethnic minorities, Shafaq, speaking to your point, of course, our trials are still not diverse. And so that means that as clinicians, we don't have a good evidence base on which to base clinical decisions. And there are several things that I want to say in relation to that. One is that if we're going to design inclusive trials, we need to have diverse researchers. We need to have diverse representation on funding panels. We need to have diverse representation in editorial boards, senior academic promotion panels, you know, all the ways in which gender disparity is played out across society feeds into this problem. So this isn't just a problem in Parkinson's. This is, you know, a much more widespread societal problem. And I think that we also need to understand, as Manon and Laura have both alluded to, what it is that supports women to take part in studies, but particularly if they're not designed to be female friendly. In the ways that we've talked about, is accessible for a woman who might be a caregiver or have other roles. But beyond that, we need to understand the societal norms that pertain to men and women and the social support structures available for men and women with Parkinson's. And there is an emerging literature about this, actually, that the experience of living with Parkinson's is different for men compared with that of women, because of, I guess it's a stereotype, but the way that women might experience illness more generally, coping strategies that are developed, care access behaviours. We know that women in a caring role are much more likely to have carer burnout and than men. And so we might need care to be structured differently for women than it is for men in order for them to access care and indeed research opportunity. And then just a last point around the language that's used and the way that symptoms might present. Laura, you mentioned this with the REM sleep behavior disorder, and of course this isn't unique. With the way that we understand Parkinson's comes from a terminology and I guess a vocabulary that we have had for decades, and maybe those, in inverted commas, atypical presentations of women are very typical presentations of women, but because the data isn't understood from women, we're not using the right words to really understand, to ask women how are your symptoms affecting you, or to understand when women are explaining their symptoms that they're not triggering the right thought processes in the doctors. And that comes back to the question that you asked, which is about the training. Yeah, if we understand how Parkinson's can present in its early stages, what words could be used in men versus women, and we build that into the way that we train neurologists and doctors in the future, then hopefully some of this will be mitigated to some extent.
Brilliant. Thank you. I'm going to hand
Yeah,
over to Shafaq for the last question.
So thank you very much, Richelle. And so we've discussed why and what needs to be addressed. Now we should probably move on to consider how we can begin to implement change to accelerate the inclusion of sex and gender in Parkinson's research. Laura, how could you perhaps talk about how we might be able to better measure and represent gender differences within research and how we present Parkinson's? I mean, I think that's already been discussed a bit, but
Yeah.
if there's anything else you want to add to that.
We've covered some points, haven't we? So I'll try and keep it quite brief. But I think one point really comes down to reporting. So reporting of gender, reporting of sex within different types of research, and not just trials, but throughout the research process, really making sure that's accurately reported, accurately coded. And I think the message guidance that you alluded to earlier really has some nice input on how to do that and how to kind of justify the sampling. And I guess what I want to highlight there is that even if the samples aren't equal, or even if it's not, you've had difficulties recruiting, it's still really worth reporting that within the paper so that others can make an accurate judgment on the findings and how conclusive they are about differences between sexes and genders. And also then future research can bring that together and synthesize, even if it is from a small sample, into a meta-synthesis or a systematic review. So we need that information there. And then I think just building on other points that have already been raised around accessibility, we shouldn't say that different sex and gender are hard to reach. We should be kind of going to those communities and making sure studies are more accessible to them. So practical things involving different people with lived experience at the start, making sure studies are planned around them, adequate compensation, flexible time slots, convenient locations. So making sure studies are accessible to different people.
Very important, isn't it? Just to re-emphasize Laura's point that the message framework for making sure that for research is available online, and you can, I think hopefully someone will have pasted it into the chat box as well. So there's a framework for researchers to look through while they're doing their work. Manon, we touched on how Parkinson's medications can often have different side effects and responses in women. Why might this be an indication of the importance of including women early on in Parkinson's research, both in early clinical trials and in preclinical work?
The literature on the fact that women experience more adverse events is really kind of recent, so beginning of the 2000s. So it's a known fact, and it's definitely an argument to have women included in studies early on, and not only do post-marketing studies like this can be the case with real-life data, it's post-marketing studies. So this is definitely something to consider when regarding new medication, because for the medications that are already available, we can do studies, but it's going to be like studies that are done after the medication has been designed, after all of these regulation and authorization. So it's something to definitely put on the agenda moving forward with new medication, disease-modifying therapies, and so on. But also something that has to be considered for device-aided therapies that are currently available. I think the new levodopa or the lesigon or something like that. The body image that may be different between male and female is something that has been seldomly considered, that should be considered, the usability of the device, of the medication. And just to answer some of the questions that are in the chat, it is really the problem of women's health is really not limited to Parkinson. It's a general issue. And for instance, for a myocardial infarction, the symptoms are really different, and women are underdiagnosed and undertreated. And there are some studies that have been done in the ER where women and non-white people are actually evaluated differently by doctors. That is not, done consciously. It's due to also biases, unconscious biases, and lack of training. It's not something that is done on purpose, of course, at least most of the time. So it's a general issue, it's a societal issue that's really not limited to Parkinson. And financing studies targeted to women is really something that should be put on the top of the agenda of government, but also research institutes. And it's something that we, as researchers, as clinicians, we have to put forward as women, as citizens. And it's really something that is general, not limited to PD, unfortunately.
Absolutely. That's such an important point you make, that we as women, whether we be researchers, whether we be patients, whether patients who do research, whether whoever we are, and until we start pushing for ourselves, it's not going to happen. So, you know, we really do, all of us, those in the fields of research, please, 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 that are female and not female, please just start looking at more work to do with research to do with women's specific studies. Camille, so what do you think we can do in order to get some robust evidence to implement change for the future?
Yeah,
maybe
so
like
my first suggestion, Shafaq, would just be to reiterate what you exactly just said. So we definitely need more women participants in studies, particularly natural history, data collection studies, large scale population studies, which those sorts of data sets will be used to develop tools. They'll be used to develop risk algorithms and those sorts of things. And if we don't have women in contributing data to those studies, then we'll have risk algorithms that are based on male populations. And as Manon said, that's already been an issue in the cardiovascular world. And these things are coming for Parkinson's disease. So we just need to make sure that we have representative data in those studies. So an alert to a shout out for participation in the first instance. I think funders are becoming, there's a question in the chat about the funding. I think funders are becoming, well, they're not becoming, they are very alert to this issue. This is COVID highlighted particularly the massive need for more inclusive research if we're going to design therapies and understand how they work in different communities. And there is a requirement for most funders now to have really robust inclusivity plans outlined in the applications. And of course, with that comes additional cost. And I'm hoping that the funders then will be sympathetic to that additional cost in terms of funding research that is more inclusive. We also need to understand what the barriers to therapy are. There will be some that are part of the barrier might be clinician gatekeeping. It might be, you know, a stereotype view of that this person might be suitable for that therapy or another. But we know some of it might be driven by choice. So what are the parameters within which women make a treatment choice compared with men? You know, on average, might women be more risk averse, for example? There's the body image issue. And we know that women are much less likely to have deep brain stimulation, for example, than men. So women are certainly being disenfranchised when it comes to potentially quite effective therapies for Parkinson's disease. And the other thing that I just want to mention is understanding biases within the way that we measure outcomes. So when we do research, of course, we think of our primary outcome measure, our secondary outcome measures, and we apply those uniformly across the data sets that we've collected. And then we make a decision on what sort of effect size we're expecting to see from a treatment. And we might look at what we understand to be the minimum clinically important difference as captured by that measure. And we do not know whether the minimum clinically important difference in a part 2 score for the MDS UPDRS is the same as in women as it is for men. We've never looked at that, for example. So we're making decisions with biases inherently built in because of our historical research practices, and taking a critical lens to all of our steps, a lot of which are so ingrained, I think is really important.
It's going to be very difficult. It's almost like having to deconstruct the system to make it more effective, and that is very, very difficult to do when it's so historical. So should we move on to Q&A now, Richelle, do you think?
Yeah, I think so. We've got about 12 minutes left. So
Yeah,
I see a couple there in the chat that have been given to us. So maybe I'll start with the first one to the panel. Is there an issue for diagnosis for women? Several women I know had a much more difficult route to diagnosis. I think that was from a man, actually. I don't know if the panel wants to speak to that or any comments on that. Do you feel that there's an issue in terms of diagnosis of women? Is it taking longer?
So I don't know that I see that I can see on my thing here that Cure Parkinson's would like to answer the question. So Cure Parkinson's might have some numbers. So I'm just going to go from my gut feeling here. So I think there is, I I mean, lots of people have got terrible diagnosis experiences, not just women, of course. There are plenty of men who are also struggle to get a timely diagnosis or go around the houses a bit. And I think this is partly to do with the myths surrounding Parkinson's. There's a sort of typical unilateral tremor presentation, and if you don't have that typical presentation, I think it can be hard to get a diagnosis. And this speaks to what I was touching on before, is the language used to describe symptoms might not resonate with the ear of whoever's listening. And this comes back to that training issue that you mentioned, Shafaq, that if we are just trained to look for tremor and trained to hear the word slowness before a Parkinson's bell rings in our minds, then that's going to impact diagnosis experience, and that might, of course, impact women more.
Thank you. So then there's another question. Have there been any studies on postmenopausal women with Parkinson's? I know in terms of the Radboud group have done a survey of postmenopausal women, and it's shown that basically postmenopausal women reported worse symptoms than premenopausal women. I think that probably ties in with the estrogen honestly declining. But I don't know if we've actually got any intervention trials or any, more robust than just a survey study.
I'm not sure. I'd like to share another thought around this topic with my neurologist hat on, which is neurologists are not the best people to be treating menopause. Yeah. And so if the reason for saying that is if a woman is in a Parkinson's clinic and describes symptoms that are reflective of Parkinson's, it's going to be a very good day for me if I remember to think, could this be menopause? And there is a danger if people have a diagnosis for them to be put in a bucket and people stop thinking about other things that could be causing those same symptoms. And so I wonder whether some of this might be that actually menopause is not well treated in women with Parkinson's, as opposed to Parkinson's not being well treated in women post-menopause. I think that it could be both sides.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point.
Yeah, very good point. Because with me, I was diagnosed at 40, but I went through menopause in my late 30s. Little did we realize. And I think some of that is because, yes, the menopause just wasn't picked up upon at all by anyone, including me. I had a Marina in that, which is why. And the neurologist who I saw, I don't even know whether, I don't see her anymore, whether she even thought maybe some of this could be menopause. I don't know. But at the age of, 39, 40, not many people would really. I didn't. So it's an easy mistake to make. So we're coming up to 5:52. Should we do one more question, Richelle?
Just want to say, before we move on to another question, it was interesting. I was at the MDS a couple of years ago, and Professor Michelle Hugh was on a panel with Ray Chowdhury. It was about non-motor symptoms, and I asked the question about shoulder pain and in women with Parkinson's, and it was very interesting. She said that pretty much most of the women that she saw that had shoulder pain were postmenopausal, and when they went on HRT, the symptom resolved. Now, that's obviously a very general kind of comment, and I'm sure that's not the case of everyone having to go on HRT. But I suppose I'm just wondering, it is actually known that frozen shoulder is actually predominantly a female condition, and it obviously is one of those flags, prodromal kind of symptoms for Parkinson's. So I suppose in terms of, is there a role for neurologists to be trained in menopause? Not that they actually have to treat the menopause, but to help pick up those, because it seems that the non-motor symptoms are so similar to the menopause symptoms. That is there a way, of actually, as you say, having that sort of little flag that comes up and goes, okay, maybe we need to think about this?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right, Richelle. I see Helen Matthews put a comment in the chat to the same effect. How can we join up those dots? So it's a training need, isn't it? I went to a very excellent presentation by a woman whose name I can't remember, but her specialist area of interest was treating the menopause, and she was talking to the Parkinson's Disease Nurse Specialist Association, and it was a really phenomenal talk. And those are the sorts of educational opportunities that we need to have access to as neurologists. and have a few tests up our sleeves and a few early treatment options up our sleeves, so that we can treat women, or at least start to be treating women whilst they're waiting for more specialist investigations or consults.
Manon, I see you've got your hand up. Do you want to?
Yeah, so I just wanted to add, because the issue you guys raised of neurologists being not hormone specialists and so on, it's basically because Parkinson's is really at the intersection of all kind of medical specialties, and now that our medicine has been very compartmentalized, it might be difficult to make some connection, and even more for women issues. And so the hormonal imbalance, it's a global issue for women. And when you consider endometriosis, for instance, 1 in 10 women, so some women may also have Parkinson's and endometriosis. So it's really one thing would be to kind of try to break the barriers between also medical specialization, and try to do more multidisciplinary staffs, and have a broader view on just this is for the neurologist and this is for the GI tract specialist or the urogenital specialist. So since it's a whole body disease, it should be, a whole body discussion.
So just on that, I know that the Radboud team under Bart Post, they have now a gynecologist who's part of the multidisciplinary team, and also just a neurologist, Deborah McIntyre, who's actually just moved to as a neurologist to work in St. James's Hospital here in Dublin. She is setting up a pilot trial of a women's only Parkinson's clinic. So that, I think, would be really interesting to see what that brings up, and maybe that's what we need to do is a few more of those. So we've got 4 minutes to go. Do you want to ask the last question of the panel, Shafaq, or?
Yeah, so yeah, that's a really good idea, actually. Let's just to finish up, could we just have one sentence from each of you on this as an answer to this question? If you were to pick one thing to accelerate change now, what would it be? Who wants to go first? Manon, you're not on mute. Shall we click on you?
Okay, so I would say putting finance incentives to do research on women, even though the idea is kind of depressing. We know that research is relying on money. So bursaries or research budget dedicated to women research in Parkinson's would be a good way to go.
Yeah. Camille, would you have anything to contribute?
Yeah, I would encourage all researchers to include a woman with Parkinson's in the co-creation and design of their studies.
Perfect.
100%
Love
agree.
that.
Yes, 100% agree.
Laura?
Yeah, I guess mine's a bit maybe less practical actually, but it's around how this is conceptualized, and to stop thinking of this as just a women's problem, or break down some of the taboos. And if we want this to be about personalized care and holistic care, then gender and sex needs to be sort of part of that holistic personalized view.
Yeah, and I think
That's true.
that's a really good point in terms of this is not just a women's issue, and this is, there are answers that we need for both men and women. Yeah, it's been a fantastic discussion.
Yeah, it has been really. I was just going to say to add to that, you never know, out of doing research which is women specific, like looking at estrogen or whatever, you never know whether we might find something which might actually be beneficial to men too. So,
Exactly.
win-win.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've 2 minutes to go. So just want to, finish off by saying thank you very much for Cure Parkinson's and Parkinson's UK for supporting with this webinar, and to our panel. Thank you very much for all of your insights, and to everyone who turned up. It was fantastic. We had, I think, almost 80 people. So hopefully a number of them are researchers and are going to take away some of the thoughts today and start implementing sex and gender in research. Shafaq, do you want to say anything?
I mean, I think you've said it all really. I again would like to say thank you very much to the panel, to the people that support us, Cure Parkinson's and Parkinson's UK, and also the audience. And researchers, my last thing would be please, 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 yes, go out there. Let's start finding the money that we need to fund research into women-specific research. And like I said, who knows, maybe we'll find some nuggets which will be useful for everyone.
Yeah. And
Thank you
finally,
very
thank
much
you
to
to
all of you.
yes, and to Barbara Salzberg for doing those images, and let's get them out there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone. I think we're going to time out very, very soon.
Thanks,
Slightly awkward
everyone.
bit of the-
Thank you.
Thank you.